All right, welcome to our LB's The Lover of Books author chats. If this is your first time here, welcome and thanks so much for joining. You can be live, you can be watching the video, but either way, I want to say a big thank you. Make sure you're subscribing to my YouTube channel, LB The Lover of Books. Y'all, I'm over 1,000 subscribers and big thank you to all of you for that. And if you, I just can't believe it, but I'm getting close to 12,000 hours watched on YouTube. We all love hearing from our authors. So if you have read a book, I may have already interviewed he or she. So check it out and see if you can maybe find a new book that you want to read. But so glad you're here. Like if you have any questions that you want us to do, remember, just go ahead and put that in the chat box. You can go ahead and introduce yourself as well. Tell us where you're dialing in from. I'm dialing in from North Carolina, and Joyce is at her home in New Hampshire. Welcome, Joyce. Thank you so much for joining. Uh-oh, you're muted. Let's see. We don't want you to be muted.
There
we go.
It's so much fun to be with you, and I can't wait to hear what's on everybody's mind and where you're coming from.
Well, just to give her a quick introduction, I don't know if y'all know this, but she's the author of 18 books. If you haven't read some of her backlist, you need to check out Labor Day, To Die For, Count the Ways, and its new sequel that just came out, How the Light Gets In, that was published this year. I'm hoping she'll maybe give us a little blurb of that as well. But she is also a founder of Right by the Lake, a week-long workshop on the arts and craft of a memoir held every year since 2001 in Lake, pronounce it for me?
Atitlan.
Atitlan in Guatemala. So I'm so excited that you're here. Can you just give us your best blurbs to get us kicked off on?
Sure, I would love to. So the story of the Bird Hotel, and maybe at some point, I hope I'll get a chance to tell you how it came about, because it's kind of an interesting story. Bird Hotel tells the story of a woman named Irene, who's been living in San Francisco. I'm not going to give any spoilers.
Oh, wait, this group talks major spoilers. We've all read it. And that's the great thing about this book club. Like, we want to hear the story on it.
Yes. I'm not going to assume that everybody's read it. So I won't say anything still that will kind of destroy it. But Irene has been living in San Francisco, and she experiences a terrible tragedy in her life. I won't say what. And she basically barely knows if she wants to live or die. But she gets herself on a bus and not really caring where she goes. And she ends up in a little country in Central America. She knows nothing of Central America or Spanish. And a boy takes her to an old, broken down, falling down hotel that's run by an expat woman. And for reasons I won't go into, because I'm not used to this no spoiler business, she ends up running the hotel. The hotel is a mess. And at first, she thinks that she just wants to fix it up enough to sell it and move on with her miserable life. But she does two things. She ends up bringing the hotel back to life and bringing herself back to life. The book is, it's one of 12 novels that I've written, and it's the only one, I think, of the 12 that has an almost fairy tale quality to it. People come and go to the hotel. She has a love affair. There's some very bad people too, and some very scary things happen there that we may talk about. But we see her being basically rejuvenated in this kind of magical place. And I will tell you that I never named the country in the book. It's an imaginary place, but it's definitely hugely inspired by a country that I know very well, where I have spent a lot of time, Guatemala, and where, as you mentioned, where I've hosted a memoir retreat for women for almost 25 years now.
That's amazing. I do want to hear the origin story of how this came up. So why don't you go ahead and dive in straight to that?
Okay. So as I just said, every year I have had a little tiny house on the shores of a giant and very beautiful lake. I think this lake is one of the most beautiful places on the planet, surrounded by volcanoes, a very deep, very blue lake. in a small Mayan indigenous village. And I first came there years and years ago and made it it had a kind of magical effect on me at a very difficult time in my life. So it was, for years, it was my little writing retreat. I just went there by myself. I finished many books there. But once a year, I would go down to host my writing retreat. And I went down there in March of 2020. I don't need to tell anybody what was going on in March of 2020. I had no clue if any of the 15 women who were signed up to meet with me would make it. And amazingly, almost everyone did. Um, and we had a very unusual retreat. The airport closed down. I knew that nobody was going to be left stranded. I knew that eventually the US State Department would send a plane, and they did many days later, 12 days. But we all sort of hunkered down. The chef never made it, so we hired local women in the village to make us a lot of guacamole and rice and beans, and we had a fabulous retreat that lasted longer than usual. But eventually the plane came, and the women went home. But I didn't want to go home. I knew, Laura, that that I was in the very best place that I could possibly be during a global pandemic, in a beautiful spot where I could swim every day, where there were gardens and fruit trees and birds singing. And so I chose to stay, and I invited the two youngest women who had come to the retreat, who I hadn't known before, Jenny and Shiren. They were both 32, to stay with me. And I figured we'd probably be together for a few weeks. We stayed for 6 months by choice. And they were probably, I want to say, the 6 best months of my life. And we all became hugely productive. I had a little writing cabin, and I would go up every day. We taught Shiren how to swim. She didn't know how to swim. Jenny started a podcast. Shiren was a composer, and she recorded bird songs, which you can actually hear if you get the audio version of the Bird Hotel. And I finished my novel, Count the Ways. I completely rewrote it, finished it. And every night, after a long day of really exciting, inspiring work, we would gather out on the deck of my house under the stars, look out at the lake and the volcano. We dressed up, we lit candles. I have candles lit now, incidentally, out on my porch here in New Hampshire. And I would read out loud to the girls from the chapter of Count the Ways that I had finished that day. And everything was great until a terrible thing happened, which was that I finished the book. And the girls said, "What are we going to do now? We need another story." And that story that I really wrote initially for them, it was like their bedtime story, was The Bird Hotel. And it was an act of imagination that I set it in a place that was a lot like where we were, except that there was no hotel and there were no guests at the hotel, and but the place was physically, there was a lake and there were volcanoes, and there was my imagination. And every night I read out loud what I'd written. There are, as you know, maybe there are 100 chapters in the book, so we were there for more than 100 nights. It was kind of like the Arabian Nights, actually, the way I would read out loud to them. And one amazing thing did happen after I had finished the book. COVID never came to the village, but the village was totally safe that way. But terrible unemployment did. People were going hungry. It was a Mayan indigenous village where people really lived from one paycheck to the next, and all the tourists were gone. So I decided I would hire a little crew of men just to give them jobs. And I hired 20 men, actually, which I could afford to do in Guatemala, and pay them well, as I couldn't in the US. And I drew a little drawing of a little guest cottage that I wanted them to build. And it turned out so beautiful. And COVID was still going on, that I made another drawing of another guest cottage and another guest cottage and another guest cottage. And at the end of that year, I did actually have, as I do now, a bird hotel, which I run. I sort of write books in my spare time almost now. I think there are 22 people staying at the Bird Hotel tonight. It is the most beautiful place anybody could imagine. It's called Casa Paloma, and every one of the cabins is named after one of the books that I've written. And it gives jobs now to about 25 people in that village year round.
Okay, Joyce, it's a you made a fairy tale come true. I
It
mean,
is a little bit of fairy tale. I'm realizing it's kind of dark, so I'm going to see if I can get my light a little closer. There's no
sure,
electricity on my porch, so I just light candles.
no worries.
See if
We
I
feel
can.
like we're right at home with you, Joyce.
Here we go. There. Maybe that'll be a little brighter. We'll hope.
Kind of like Irene, there's no such thing as too many candles, right?
That's how I feel. Yeah.
I figured it might be.
I'll show you. Here we go.
Oh, look how magical. Look at the lake, y'all.
There's,
Look at
there's a
that.
much smaller lake that I'm looking out at right now, which is where I
And no volcanoes in New Hampshire either.
no volcano, sadly, but it's beautiful here.
Well, and how lucky for those two women. They basically had their own fairy
Oh,
tale written by
all of
Joyce Maynard. I mean,
for all
like,
of us, they really became like daughters to me, and I they're still very much in my life. We get together at least once a year ever since.
sounds like great karma to me. How did you first end up? Was it 2001 in Guatemala? Like, how did that
Oh,
happen?
I had been to Guatemala. I came first to Guatemala. I'm still trying to get a little more light on the subject. I first came to Guatemala when I was 19 years old, which is
Okay.
to um 50 years ago, 51 years ago. I turned 70 last November. And I came myself in the aftermath of a heartbreak. Different and less extreme than what Irene suffers in the book. But I too believed, as a 19-year-old does who has her heart broken, that my life was over. And I ended up on my travels finding this lake and falling in love with it. I didn't come back for 28 years until my daughter was there to study Spanish. It's a great place to learn Spanish, among many other things. And I went back, and it had the same sort of magical pull on me. And that time, I decided to stay. I hadn't intended to, but all my children were grown and gone. And I rented a tiny little house on the shores of that lake. And I wrote my novel, The Usual Rules, there actually that year. I had no internet, no phone, I was living by myself. It was 2001. And I used to take a long swim. I swam about a mile every day. And one day on one of my swims, I saw a sign that said "Se vende," which means for sale. And I bought a piece of land there. And that was the beginnings of my hotel. I think maybe I'm going to just go inside. So I love being out here on the porch, but I know it's kind of dark for everybody probably. So here I go.
It
I'm coming.
sounds like there's a lot of similarities between not just you and Irene or Joan, but also with the original owner. Like, I mean, that's how she sort of found the property, right?
It,
I mean,
it's true. It's true. And you know, because at this point, I've hosted close to 1,000 women at my retreats over the many years, and also guests at my hotel. I've seen again and again this lake has a kind of healing effect. I'll sound all woo woo here, and I I am not usually somebody who buys into all that stuff, but something happens when you swim in that lake, and so I love to introduce it to other people.
well, I think it's fabulous. If you want to check out pictures, she has a website, y'all. It really is a stunning, beautiful place, and I can see why it does have that therapeutic effect. I do want to go a little bit deeper into the Bird Hotel, and you do mention an important a book that many people may know, "Love in the Time of Cholera." Was that
Yes.
also an
Oh, I'm
inspirational
so
book?
pleased that you mentioned that book. It's one of my absolute favorites, Laura. Um, I should mention during the pandemic, we were in kind of, limited circumstances. We couldn't go anywhere. And that book was there at the house. I had always loved it. but I reread it that year. And I think I should mention that um, I just about never read when I'm writing because I get too swept up in another writer's voice and I want to hold on to my own. So I I didn't read Love in the Time of Cholera while I was writing The Bird Hotel, but but I before I wrote it, I had just reread it, and I think that sense of a little bit of a fairy tale, kind of a combination of reality and fairy tale that Garcia Marquez is such a master of. I wanted that to be infused in my book, and I think it is.
It is.
It teaches me that I think it's a book that makes people feel very good.
Absolutely. You start off with it, but then you tie it right back into Tom towards the end with that character. And she's like, did he even read this book? And I did love that you brought it back in. And I thought it was beautiful.
Oh,
You also mentioned that there are 100 plus chapters in this book. Was that a conscious decision
no,
to give
it
us?
was it really was just that we had this bedtime story situation with the
Uh-huh.
girls, and so I wanted the chapters to be I wanted to give them a chapter every night. I'll tell you kind of a funny story just so you can kind of picture the scene. So you wouldn't think this, but this is an interesting thing about Guatemala. When very high end stores in the United States, stores like Neiman Marcus, have beautiful, very expensive gowns, $1,000 gowns that they have not succeeded in selling, they're not going to donate those to Goodwill because the people who spent the $1,000 would be kind of irritated. They ship them to Guatemala and they end up in the markets in Guatemala where I buy them for about $1. So at the point that the pandemic happened, I had a closet full of gorgeous gowns. And every night every night, the girls and I, they were half my age, of course. Every night, the three of us would dress up in these gowns, light the candles, make a fabulous meal. We had a garden. Shiren was Asian. She was a really good Asian cook. A fisherman would come up to the dock with fish. It actually was a pretty magical time. And we made these great meals and we sat in our gowns and then I read the chapters. So I wanted to make sure every night that I had kind of a complete story for them.
Well, you gave us that full book of complete stories, and we're so thankful for it. You did quote in the book, when I took out my pencils and got to work, the rest of the world went away. And I know you're talking about her with her painting, but is it quite like that for you when you write?
Oh, it absolutely. It's happening. It's going on right now, actually, Laura. I should say that it's particularly nice to visit with you and with everybody else who's there um, tonight because I've been holed up in my little cabin in New Hampshire working on a new novel, and I barely go out into the world when I do that. I become very, very um, quiet and isolated, and I'm alone sometimes for days on end. So you're actually, this might sound a little pathetic, but it's not actually. You're the first person I've spoken to today because I probably was working for 10 hours. So I've been with my characters and I really do lose myself in their world. And it's a very joyful experience. It's lonely. And that is one of the things that I've had to get used to about my this career of mine that I've basically been a writer for my entire adult life. I published my first book 51 years ago, so long time. And the only way I know to do it is to be by myself when I'm doing it. Um,
Well,
so yes,
it sounds so much in the book that, Luis, they surrounded themselves with artwork, all over. Even though the place was crumbling down, there was so much art.
and
Um,
there is at my house too.
and that's
Yeah.
what I was wondering. But one particular piece that stood out was the painting of disasters. Was that inspired by anything? Because it was so
Oh,
peculiar that
I,
even when every disaster hit, it survives. Like it's that reminder that's going to
there,
stay.
um, there is an artist, an indigenous artist. He barely speaks Spanish. He speaks the Mayan dialect, whose work I just adore. Uh, Isais Hernandez is his name, Diego Isais Hernandez. And for years, I'd been seeing his work in the market, small paintings like this. And about 17 years ago, I said to Isais, could you, and his paintings were always of disasters. There'd be like a flood or, a fire or something. And I said to him, but they weren't kind of grim. They had a certain kind of lightheartedness about them. And I said to him, could you make me a giant painting with all the disasters in one painting? So he did. I commissioned this giant artwork. It fills a wall in my house, and it has swarms of bees, rabid dogs, a flood, an earthquake, a hurricane, a crash of a couple of tuk-tuks, boys falling in a lake. But there's a sort of a cheerfulness about it too. Anyway, I have now commissioned Isais. I have 3 giant disaster paintings at my house. I think you can maybe on my website, if you go to the link of Casa Paloma, you may see some of the artworks. But when it was time to find a cover for the bird hotel, right away, I knew it had to be a painting of Isais. So what you see is actually a very small detail of a very large painting. That's actually just a tiny little corner of a painting that I commissioned from him during the pandemic. And when I showed it to him, actually, he included Jenny and Shiren and me in the painting, although we look a bit at the painting. You can't see it there, but it's when I showed Isais the book, I knew he'd be very excited. And of course, he'd earned some money from that, which was great. And then he opened the book and I could see his face kind of fall because he thought it was going to be full of his artwork. And there were just words that he couldn't read. But yes, the disaster paintings are real. The swinging boat, you might remember there's a boat that sort of is hanging on chains and swings, and it's a fisherman's boat. I have such a boat at my house. Many of the artworks that I describe, the stone egg I have at my house, there are things that were made by people in that village by hand, all by hand, as all the little casitas, all the little cabins were.
Well, okay. How big is the scale of this? Because you're saying a piece like this is the cover. How big is his work?
That's probably about 1/20th of the painting. It's a giant,
Okay.
giant painting. The most recent one that I commissioned from him is actually it's a really tough painting, but I felt it was important that somebody make it. As many people in the United States do not know, Guatemala suffered a 30 years long civil war in which tens of thousands of indigenous people were disappeared. And it didn't end until 1996. And I'm sorry to say that the US government was in not a good place in that war. And it's still a very deep wound in the indigenous world. It's something that people don't talk about. They don't study it at school, but it's kind of their Holocaust. So I asked Isais if he would make a painting of that. And it hangs in my house. I wouldn't put it in anybody's bedroom. It's a kind of a, art painting. It's a painful painting, but someday I will donate that painting to a museum in Guatemala, which is really where it belongs.
Well, I hope when this does turn to paperback that we can maybe see some of his drawings or other local artists with the flora and fauna throughout the paperback, like as the beginning of the chapters, because it was it's almost like you could smell the garden. Like I really wanted more.
For now, I will say that for now, I think this link is on my website. My website is joycemaynard.com. And I believe there's a link to my place there, which is called Casa Paloma. So if you go to casapalomaretreat.com, you will see birds, see artwork, see stone carvings, textiles. There's lots of pictures, but I love your idea of putting it in a book. I do.
Well, I do love
I'll tell you why this book has not come out in paperback yet. And I sort of have readers to thank. When the book came out, it was published by a very small publisher, and it came out with very little fanfare or attention, no reviews. It wasn't in bookstores. Libraries weren't ordering it. And readers discovered it, and book clubs discovered it. And it became this enormously popular book club book. And one book club in particular, I bet there's some members of the Renee's reading group online with us now. Yeah, I thought you were one. And Renee's readers just embraced this book. So not too many days go by that somebody doesn't talk about the Bird Hotel and say that their book club is reading it. And because of that, my publisher decided, I'm sorry to say, that they were doing so well with it, they were going to hold off making the paperback. But in the meantime, I have lots of other books in paperback that you can
That's
read.
right. Well, I think it's a great thing that it's selling so well. So we won't wish it to paperback too soon. So keep it going.
Yeah.
I do love that you said it with the volcano. It was such a constant. And like you said, so serene for so many people, but it is a very disastrous thing that happens. Um,
Yes.
why did you want this buildup, and how did you decide what you were going to do with this story? Because
Oh,
you
you
know,
know, there's I forget if it was, I think it may be Chekhov who said it. If you have a story that has a gun over the mantelpiece, that gun is going to be fired. Any good writer knows you do not put something sort of, big and potentially ominous in a story and not have it come back to, bite you in the butt. Um, so the volcanoes were a presence throughout the book, one volcano in particular. And as there was a volcano out my window when I wrote this book, every morning I sat down at my desk and there was this enormous volcano that I was facing dead ahead. And so I knew it had to erupt. The volcanoes at my lake, there are 5 of them all around the lake. And I study them. I never get tired of waking up and seeing the volcano, seeing the sun rise over the volcano, set over another volcano. The volcanoes at my lake, unlike many other volcanoes in Guatemala, are inactive, so they will not be erupting. But of course, I wanted an active volcano, um, and I never know how a book of mine is going to turn out. I never know what's going to happen, and I think that's part of the reason why I write with as much excitement and enthusiasm as I do, because I can't wait to find out what's going to happen next. And the only way I'll find out is if I write the book. I'm the first reader. So it took me by surprise what happened at the end, but I was happy about it. I was glad to see.
well, start to finish, how long did this book take you? Was it just that short amount of time
It
through the
it
dinners?
was it was actually about 6 weeks. 6 weeks when the world had stopped, There was nothing going on except me writing all day long, looking at that volcano and having those magical dinners with the girls and doing it all over again the next day. And they would, they we'd make the coffee in the morning and then they'd kind of shoo me off to my writing cabin and say, "Get back to work. We can't wait to find out what's going to happen." So I did. Um, so yes, actually, we stayed on much after the Bird Hotel was finished.
How long does this one compare to your others? Like, this is 6 weeks
You know,
versus what's your normal experience like?
there is no normal. They're all different. I have been known to write a book in, I know this sounds a little crazy, and there may well be writers listening to us, and I don't want to give anybody the idea that, that this would be what they should, do. I'm just kind of weird this way. But um, I wrote my novel, Baby Love, my very first novel, when I was 26 in 10 days. And it really was because all I had was 10 days. I had a baby, I had lots of responsibilities. That was as long as I could take. And just, I worked like mad. I didn't stop. My daughter was in a lot of daycare for those 10 days. And I similarly with my novel To Die For, very short. The Bird Hotel short. Labor Day, which is actually one of my very favorites. It was almost as if I was possessed. I will say that I have extreme ADHD, and that makes reading a big challenge for me, actually. But the secret superpower of ADHD is hyper focus. So when I'm in a story that grips me as I want it to grip you, um, my house could be on fire and I might not notice. I am so, and that's kind of how it's been these last few days, writing the new book that I'm in the middle of now, or, you know, like a third of the way into. I just get into this zone. Yeah.
Well, Joyce, you have my number. If you need to reach out, call me when during those moments. I will
You
say
might be
also,
surprised, Laura. You know, some of the people that I turn to again and again are readers. I have a couple that I just sort of, because it does get lonely, and sometimes I just call somebody up and I say, what about this? You know, what do you think about this? And so I'll keep your number.
readers are the best. I will say, I did love the theme too when you start talking about telling one's own story, because a lot of Irene's life was, shrouded by a secret that her grandmother made her promise to keep. It
Yes.
was shrouded over her marriage, and then on through most of her time there. And when she's there with Lisa, everybody really, she couldn't say anything. But then she starts to figure out what it's like to open up. And I
Yes.
wondered if that was sort of your
Oh,
message to all the memoirists like that come to you at this writer's workshop,
no,
because
you're
it's
very,
like this.
Laura, you are very good at this. I don't think anybody has actually made that connection, but the answer is yes. I I'll say a couple of things about that. And the first is that I grew up in an alcoholic family, and um, I've always named two very distinct parts of that experience that were painful. One is that my father got drunk every night, and I adored my father. But the other part was the keeping of the secret. We never talked about it. And I felt deep shame that I was terrified that my friends would find out. You know, if anybody called our house after 6 p.m., I dove for the phone. Um, and I think that more than any other experience of my growing up has really shaped my life as a writer. I write about things we don't talk about, and I talk about them. And that takes many, many forms in different books of mine, that are, quite, set in places very different from the Bird Hotel. But I believe in shining a light on our secret pain, and it will become less painful when we do. And the other part that you identified very with a lot of perceptiveness is that for almost 30 years now, I've been teaching. I never say teaching. I've been mentoring and supporting women who usually don't even call themselves writers, in the telling of their story. It is my labor of love that I do at my workshop every year. And I now have several. It used to be just one, but there were so many women who wanted to come. And I know every woman has a story, and so many women keep them secret. And now they come and they stay in my beautiful little cabins at my house, and we have wonderful meals, and we work very hard on their writing, and also have a great time. Um, and many times I have lost count of the number of times that a woman in the writing circle has begun to speak, saying, I've never told anybody this before. And then everything opens up and it changes.
Mhm.
So yes, I didn't consciously think about that when I was writing The Bird Hotel. I never do sit down and say, this is a book about this important theme. I just want to tell you a really great story, and I want to keep you up late at night turning the pages, and maybe make you cry or make you laugh or make you feel intensely. But after the fact, I realized, yes, of course, I'm always in my books. My obsessions are always in my books, and that is one of them.
Well,
Secret keeping.
you can tell your publisher the reason why so many women keep picking this book up for book clubs is because you are shining a light on topics like this. And it gives us the chance to have that conversation. So thank you so much for doing that. And please keep it up in many formats.
I I couldn't not, Laura Beth. You know, in my This is just a sort of a random example, but it's an important one, actually. In my novel, Count the Ways, which is the first of the two novels that follow the life of a woman over the course of 60 years, you know, from the 70s to now,
Which
basically.
I loved, by the way. Love,
I
love, love.
I love those books. Those books are very close to my heart. And the woman is exactly my age. So she's young when I was young, and she's middle aged when I was middle aged, and she's now, you know, by the time the book ends, she's the age I am now. But during her child raising days, this thing happens to her. She's a really devoted mother, and she's a loving, good mother. Um, but she does this thing that she calls going to crazy land. And lots of women who read that book relate to Crazyland. It's the thing we don't talk about when we just hit the wall.
Yeah.
And it because it is too much to give and give and give all the time, and always be calm and patient and have it all together. So Crazyland is a dark little secret that I wanted to talk about. In the new book, I talk about parental estrangement, a very painful experience that Eleanor goes through with one of her adult children, who she was devoted to and very, very close to. And it is a kind of epidemic, I believe, in our country, that parents often suffer very in a lot of shame and isolation, and don't know how many other people go through it. And that really is in many ways connected with my own very young sense of shame over my father's drinking.
Well, I should have asked you this prior to this conversation, but do you have the book there? Is there any part that you can read to us?
Are we thinking of the Bird Hotel?
No, 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 your newest, so that people can get a
Oh,
little
I'd
of this.
love to. I'm just walking.
While you're
And
walking, I'm going to talk about how wonderful of a narrator you are. If you have not listened to her audiobooks,
thank you.
Joyce narrates her own audiobooks, and a lot of times an author reading it is a cost saving measure. And this one, I believe, it
Oh,
is a benefit because you are just so good and so authentic.
I
Like I
I
fell in love
love
with
to.
Count the Ways.
I have to say, basically, I won't let anybody else read my books, and I've started going back over my backlist and reading a bunch of those, recording a bunch of those. There's only one of my books. The usual rules I'm a little disturbed by, because we have a bad reader on that one. That was before I started doing this, but mostly I record my books. Labor Day was written in the voice of a young man, but luckily I have a son who's a fantastic actor. Um, uh,
Perfect.
if anybody ever watched Heart of Dixie, he was one of the stars of Heart of Dixie, but he doesn't use his Alabama accent in this book. So Willie did Labor Day, but I've done just about every other one. So I'm going to read you a very, very short passage. I would love to read you more, but I'm aware of our time, and I want to hear from readers too. The thought, I should explain, you don't really need to know much of anything, but I'll just tell you that one of Eleanor's three children is brain damaged, and that happens in the first book, Count the Ways. He has an accident in a pond, and he carries on. He's actually now an adult, and he's raising goats on the family farm, and he might be my favorite character I've ever created. I love this young man. And he's kind of the heart and soul of the book. So anyway, that's Toby, and he has a brain injury. The thought comes to Eleanor. All this time she had it wrong. All those years she spent grieving the loss of her son's brain cells. All those years when it seemed something inside him had been broken and that nothing could ever be all right again. What she sees now is the beautiful part. There is a reason some people are broken. If nobody ever broke, if everything always turned out the way you wanted, if the sun always shone and the rain never fell, if there was only spring and no winter, only music and no silence, only love without loneliness, where would beauty come from, or amazement? If nobody ever died, how could they know the preciousness of every day they got to be alive in the world? How the Light Gets In. And a
Oh,
lot happens in that one too. That's the book that I actually just published this summer, and I'm really proud of this one. I don't have a favorite book, but in many ways, How the Light Gets In. Um, I'm going to say it says everything that I wanted to say at this age and stage of my life about marriage and family and raising children and growing older and loss and recovering from loss. Yeah.
well, thank you so much for sharing and reading. And now I'm even more jealous of those two women that got to have story time over dinner every night. That
you've got to come to a workshop.
All right, be thinking of what question you would like to ask Joyce. And while you're thinking, I'm going to give her some rapid fire questions. Are you ready, Joyce?
Sure.
All right. What's your favorite album cover?
Oh, okay. Well, this is kind of a grim one in a way, but well, I love the Beatles, of course. I mean, I was an early Beatles girl, and I loved the Revolver cover, and then I got the cover of Yesterday and Today, the original one that got banned later. And actually, it had already been banned, but I steamed off the cover that had been on it, so I got the what was thought of as a very shocking cover in 1966, I think.
Did you also damage your vinyl in the process?
I did. I forgot to take the album out when I steamed it. And actually, I think one of my sons now has that album. It probably would be more valuable if the record itself hadn't been destroyed.
I don't know. When it's attached to the story, like when you say you are in the stories, you are truly in the stories. I love it. Okay, another thing was you went over the state names. Do you have a favorite state name as you've traveled across the US?
Oh my gosh. Well, so these are other states. It's not the name much as the place, of course.
Like the granite. You mentioned different ones. I was just curious.
Of course, I love New England. I'm a New Hampshire girl. And I also live part of the time in California, and California, nothing's too much more beautiful than California. But I had no idea how great Kansas City was. I had the most wonderful visit to Kansas City. I loved Columbus, Ohio. Now I have my the Ohio State hat, and I know that if you say OH, if somebody says OH, you're supposed to say IO. I had a great time in Dallas. I've had many good times in Texas. I was in Austin and Wemberley last a while back. I loved the Pacific Northwest. I'm actually going to Seattle and Portland and Ashland, Oregon in September with the new book, How the Light Gets In.
I'll check it out for that book tour. That's exciting.
Oh, sorry, I missed you. What did you say?
I was just saying, look for you on tour because that's exciting to get you see you in person.
And I'll tell you, this was a tour that I created myself, which is often the way these days. And I go where I get really enthusiastically invited. So if you want me to come to your town, get your friends of the library group to invite me, rustle up an author's night, and I will do my level best to be there.
Get ready, people. All right, hike or swim?
Oh, I love them both, but swim, definitely. I'm a water person. And when the water frozen, I skate.
What about your favorite smoothie?
I'm not a big smoothie person. But I guess I'll say matcha. When I visit my younger son, he always gets me matcha.
And New Hampshire or Guatemala?
Oh, I could not choose. That would be like choosing among your children,
And then one last one, because it's a quote of the book. Would you rather be a poor man in a place of great natural richness and beauty, or a man with money in the bank who has lost his home?
Well, if he's lost his home and he's got money in the bank, I guess he can get another home. But I'm going to say I'm all about the great natural beauty. I'm all about great natural beauty.
All right. I thought I would end with the softball pitch. All right, people, what questions do you have for Joyce? I know there's some in the chat box that I will get to. If you have one live that you want to ask, go ahead and raise your hand. I'll go ahead and start with Linda's that's in the chat box. She said,
where the person is from, if they can tell me what state.
I don't know. Linda, you'll have to tell me where you're from. She says, Irene has people that she thinks are her friends and that take terrible advantage of her. Why did you choose not to have them suffer any real consequences?
Oh, they do suffer consequences, Linda. If you're talking about Gus and Dora and the Mayan astrologer, things don't go well for them. Yeah, I believe in consequences. Yeah. As a parent of very young children, I believed there needed to be consequences. I was, I was pretty forgiving, but yeah, no, that's a very good point, but I think there are consequences.
That was our parenting phrase, obedience or consequence, and they got to choose. All right. Here's another question. What was your favorite book as a child? Monica wants to know.
My favorite book of the
As a child.
as a child. Okay. I loved God. So it depends on what age group. I was just talking to somebody about the Homer Price books when I was very young. I loved Blueberries for Sal, also Robert McCloskey. When I was older, Betsy and Tacy, the Betsy and Tacy series. And I love that because either Betsy or Tacy was a writer and she always had a little notebook, and Pippi Longstocking, I loved. The Diary of Anne Frank was really an important book to me. Yeah.
Here is another one from Beth Kennedy. I finished the book last weekend on audio and loved it. The food sounded so good. I need a dish for a book group. What do you recommend? She's in Seattle.
Oh, well, gosh, the food in the book is inspired by the real woman, Rosa, who is our chef for all our retreats. And I've been meaning to put some of Rosa's recipes up on my website. I might not have it by next weekend. What would I suggest? If you're discussing this book, I don't know if you are, but if so, oh, make some great guacamole. Yeah.
Definitely, we are requesting Rosa's recipes. And even if you can't get it by next weekend, please, please, please. I will
Okay.
say that this book did make me hungry. And I mean, some of the stuff that you like, when the big bass, the queen bass was cooked. Oh my gosh, it just
That
sounds.
real. That was real. Actually, during the pandemic, there was a night the girls and I were sitting out on the patio in our gowns. It was about midnight, and all of a sudden, we saw this light in the water, and it was kind of scary. There was this light, and it turned out there was a harpoon fisherman who was there in the middle of the night looking for a fish, and he found a fish. This harpoon fisherman did not die, but it is rather dangerous being a harpoon fisherman, and if you go down very deep, it may be that you won't come up. So we did get a queen bass, and she ran cooked it in a traditional Asian fashion.
Sounds delicious. Myrna has a question for you.
Yeah.
She said she's always felt that there are two ways to write fiction. One, to have a plot and create characters within the plot. The other way is to create the character and create the plot or challenges that the character may encounter. I believe that the latter is a more creative process, and it seems that is what you would do in your writing. But can you tell us about your process, maybe?
Absolutely, Myrna. And I agree on, the second. I'm not going to badmouth any writer who's all about plot, and some of them are wildly successful, but I believe that good story comes out of character, and that if you just decide what happens and plug people in, they're not going to be living, breathing characters in the same way. So my method, my process, insofar as I have one, and it's many things are different every time, but this is always, I begin with who's in the story, who am I writing about, and I think a long time about those people before I write. I don't know what's going to happen to them, but I know who they are. It would never be me for something that I would do to discover on page 100 that somebody who I thought was a really good guy turned out to be a real fraud, because that would then I wouldn't have written authentically about that person for the first 100 pages. And to an amazing degree, my characters lead me to my story. I'll use the example of my novel Labor Day, which is the story of a love affair that unfolds between a very lonely single mother raising her 13-year-old son on her own in a little New Hampshire town, and the escaped prisoner who she takes into her home and falls in love with over the course of a long, hot Labor Day weekend. Well, I didn't know how that book was going to end. And I knew that this was going to be difficult, um, because how are we going to resolve this love affair? But really, it was who the people were that led me to what happened, what they would do.
I love it. Lori has a comment more than a question, and she said, I loved your writing style and imagery and felt like I was immersed in the island while reading. I loved the relationships of the natives and how supportive they were of each other. And so I just, I assume that this is also your experience there in Guatemala, but I
Yeah.
wanted to follow up with a question here because Walter's story was left unknown, right? She never heard back from him. And so, he really wanted to get to America so he could have money to come back and purchase his own land. And I kind of hoped he would show up next door as
Well,
one
guess
of the
what? I'm
what?
writing a sequel.
Wait, what? There's a
Uh,
sequel?
to this book. And that's not what I'm doing right now because I actually have to be in Guatemala. I have to be in my writing cabin looking out at that volcano to write the sequel. But I will be writing a sequel this January. So yeah.
Oh my gosh, I have the chill bumps. And Adele wanted to know the exact same thing. What happened to Walter? So in January, I'm like breathless. You're going to be writing the book in
I
January.
and many other characters that even people that you think you're never going to hear about again. For anybody who's read Count the Ways but hasn't read, I'm having to walk into my kitchen because I need to charge my phone now. So you'll see my slightly messy kitchen.
Hey, we all have them. Look at my bookshelves. I can't talk.
There were many things that happened in Count the Ways that I left kind of open, even though I had no intention of writing a sequel. But I'm so grateful that I did because I had some material to go back on. So yeah, you will. I think we're going to hear more about Walter.
Okay. I'm so happy about that. That makes my night. Thank you so much for that. Can you tell us anything about what you are working on now, though, or is that hush hush?
I have a rule that I don't talk about it until I'm really sure I've got a book. And then you
Sure.
can, if there are some of you who aren't yet my Facebook friends, I'll tell you that I'm a very active Facebook person, and I sometimes just publish little stories from my life. Some mornings I get up and something has happened, and I just want to talk about it. So I'm sure I'll be talking about the new book on Facebook, but not
Not
quite.
yet. No problem. We will definitely be tuning in to hear more. And you definitely need to follow her on Facebook. It's a joy. I don't see any more questions, so I'm going to ask a couple. I know you said that you don't really read while you're writing, but what books have you read recently, or even classics in the past that you think, oh, this reading group would really want that recommendation?
Yeah, I'm going to mention one who's a writer that you may never have heard of, William Maxwell. I love, there's a novel called Time Will Darken It. Gosh, I think it was probably published in the 50s or the 60s. I just reread it recently. It's such a beautiful book. Another one that I just reread, and I read this very deliberately before starting the new book because there were some elements I wanted to study. Is Ian McEwan's On Chesil Beach. It's just it's a heartbreaking story. One of the things that I love about that book is that all the action takes place over a handful of days, almost a handful of hours. Um, and then it's the man who one of the two people who's experienced this story is looking back on it like 40, 50 years later. And I wanted to sort of see how he did that because that I will say that is a structure that I'm using for this new book of mine. So I'll mention that. I'll mention a dear friend. It's funny, I'm mentioning men, and usually I'm all about women writers. I love Claire Lombardo's new book, Same as It Ever Was. Um, but I'm going to mention a writer who's a fabulous writer and a dear, dear friend who I did an event with a couple weeks ago, Andre Dubus. And Andre Dubus II, his father was also a writer. And he published a novel, I guess it's about a year ago now, called Such Kindness. It's just, gosh, do we need kindness these days? It's a beautiful, beautiful novel, quiet novel. Didn't get a lot. I like to talk about books that people don't talk about because we do tend to hear the same ones over and over, and often for good reason. They're great, but I like to give a leg up to books that maybe don't get talked about as much.
Well, thank you for that. We will be checking them out. Michelle just posted another question
Great.
in the chat books. It says, I noticed that Irene or Joan was an artist as well as Eleanor. She wants to know if you are also an artist, or do you like to draw, or what brings you to that?
I do. I do like to draw and paint. And if you've ever been to a reading of mine, I always draw in your book. I don't think I have ever sent somebody home from a reading without a drawing of mine in the book. I do it partly because I love to draw, and partly because it gives me a little bit more time to talk to the person whose book I'm signing if I'm making a drawing. And every now and then on my website, I'll make an offer. I like to support independent booksellers, and I'll link up to some independent bookseller who's willing to send you a signed book by me that will have a drawing. There's a bookseller in New Hampshire that I like to give a leg up to when I can. I'm actually, while we're waiting, while we're talking about art, I'm going to mention that the cover of How the Light Gets In, this book, is like the cover of the Bird Hotel. It is a painting that I actually own. It's a painting in my house by a dear friend. Here's the original painting.
Wow.
My friend Danny Thibault did this, and that is my bedroom in this house. And I love the paintings so much. Hold on, I'm going to put this phone down so I can do this. That I decided to make a T-shirt of that painting and a tote bag. You cannot buy them. The only way you can get one is if you host a book club discussion of How the Light Gets In, and then you write to me. It's all in the honor system. I'll believe you that you're doing it, and I will send you How the Light Gets In T-shirt in the size that you request and a tote bag.
Oh, how cool. All right, people. I'm seeing some nods out there. It's happening. So
Good.
Well, this has just been the best night of conversation, Joy. Like, I'm just so ecstatic that you spent some time with us. And
I was probably a little overexcited because, as I said, you were my social event for the week, possibly. I'm working really hard here to write you a new book.
No, you were doing such a fabulous job, and we are so appreciative that you take time out from writing just to spend a little bit of time with us and answer questions. And thanks everybody for attending. I will kind of give you a highlight. So in 1 week, we're going to be chatting with Lauren Grodstein, who wrote We Must Not Think of Ourselves. It's a read with Jenna Peck, and it was inspired by a little known piece of history, the underground group that kept an archive to ensure that the lives of Jewish occupants of the Warsaw Ghetto in World War II were not lost to history. This is a heart-wrenching novel of love and defiance that people calls gripping, emotional, and against all odds, but still hopeful. I don't know if y'all read Madeline Miller's Circe book and the Song of Achilles, but she says this book is a masterpiece, profound, gripping, urgent, and beautiful. So hopefully you have a chance to read that and join us next week. I know that a group of people are going to head to the Holocaust Museum in DC to see a special exhibit. So if you ever get a chance to go to DC, there is some definite artifacts there that you can look for. But Joyce, thank you so much. This is such a marvelous work of fiction.
I had a great time, and you do a fabulous job, Laura Beth.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Connect with her on Instagram, connect with her on Facebook.
There are some pretenders out there, but I'm the real one.
She's the real Joyce Maynard. And she also has a cool PDF kit with discussion questions for your book club. So check that out as well. I'd love for everybody to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Follow me on LB, the Lover of Books. And also just leave your reviews, recommendations. And I hope to talk with you again soon, Joyce. I know people are already talking about a yoga retreat down at your place in Guatemala.
A lot of people host them down there. Absolutely. You can come and you get Rose's cooking.
Ah, wonderful. Well, what a great night of literary discussion. Thanks everybody for showing up. I really appreciate it. Joyce, you're the best. And I'm sure we'll chat soon. Good night, everybody.